Welcome to episode 108 of the Ask Historians podcast. Today we're going to be talking with Dr. Keri Leigh Merritt, who specializes in labor history in the antebellum American South. We'll be discussing issues directly related to her latest book, Masterless Men, Poor Whites and Slavery in the Antebellum South, published in 2017 by Cambridge University Press. With that said, let's get on with the show.
Welcome to the Ask Historians podcast.
Welcome to the Ask Historians podcast. Today we're here with Dr. Keri Leigh Merritt. She is a historian and independent scholar. She obtained her PhD from the University of Georgia and recently published a book via the Cambridge University Press called Masterless Men, Poor Whites and Slavery in the Antebellum South. Professor Merritt, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for coming on. So before we get into talking about your book and your field, I just wanted to ask, what first drew you to history and which authors, the writing of which authors really most inspired you?
Well, I grew up in the Deep South. I was actually born in southern Mississippi and lived most of my life in metro Atlanta. So, I had grandparents and family members from all over the Deep South, from New Orleans to southern Appalachia. And so history is always very important down here. It's constantly in your face. You're confronted by the Civil War, from the time you can think straight. And it always just drew me in, kind of thinking about these issues of especially race and racism, but also just the past of the place I lived in. And my mom in particular grew up very poor in southern Appalachia. She actually grew up in an old mill village. It's kind of like a deindustrialized town where people just lived in these old mill village houses, very, very poor part of town. And in that particular town, in the upper class and middle class sections of town, it was completely segregated. But when you got to those poor little mill village houses, it was actually very integrated. And I'm not saying there wasn't racism there. There definitely was. But people lived together, they worked together, they traded together, and it was more of an interracial community than anything I'd seen anywhere. And so that kind of interplay of race and class pushed me to really start reading in high school, and then centering in on Southern history, particularly in college.
Interesting. And what are there any authors in particular which really drew you to the field, or?
So in college, I started taking classes from James Rourke, who wrote widely on free blacks and black masters. And so I really started reading a lot about slavery. I always loved Eugene Genovese. And by the time I got to graduate school, started branching out everything I could read about 19th century South, from agriculture to, the Civil War. Learned as much as I could about slavery, and really kind of realized there wasn't that much about class and about poor people besides the enslaved themselves.
Interesting. Though there is scholarship on class in the 19th century. Didn't Eric Fauner write about it, or?
Yes, definitely. But most of the class analysis Fauner uses applies to the North. We always look at the working classes of the North and the wage slaves of the North. And in the South, people did, there were people that did look at, like Stephanie McCurry, look at yeoman farmers, people that owned land and also owned between 1 and some estimates go up as high as 10 slaves. But my point has always been that anybody who owns land, and particularly anybody who owns slaves, has much more in common from a class and economic wealth perspective with slaveholders, the big slaveholders, than they did with people who were completely cut out of the system of mastery.
Interesting. That reminds me of what I've read. I'm not a scholar in Haitian history, but it reminds me a bit of how during the Haitian Revolution, you saw the the struggle between different levels of white planters ended up ending when the slaves revolted, and then the white planters, both large and small, kind of united in their overall interest, because their core interest was similar, because they had their wealth was based on slavery.
Right, exactly. I mean, anybody who even owned land, probably had some sort of interest in slavery, particularly in the Deep South, where, you lived in slave societies, where this percentage of population that were enslaved approaches, 40 to 50% of the population. And I argue there's a fundamental difference between, the upper South states, the societies with slaves. It was a very different social construction, social hierarchy there than it was in the Deep South, where you've got almost half your population enslaved. Because when you enter in, a slave society like that, you just have to think about how much policing, surveillance, constant vigilance to keep people down and to keep the, information from being disseminated has to be in those kind of societies, just to keep society from turning into, bloody rebellion every day. It's an extremely violent society. It's an extremely authoritarian society. People don't have basic rights. Even white people, as I argue in the book, don't have basic American rights that we take for granted, even for people of the 19th century. They just didn't have them. There was no due process, censorship. They were going through everything in the mails, everything in the newspapers, keeping information away from poor white people.
So jumping off of, just to dig into that point a little bit more, as many listeners will no doubt be aware, in the early 19th century, we get the series of, as you were mentioning, this implementation of a series of policies, for example, codification of laws to keep enslaved people and even free people of color from restriction of movement for them, restriction on emancipation, all these measures to try and keep the enslaved population from rebelling. What relationship did poor Southern whites have to the surveillance apparatus, or the militias in order to control the slave population?
So I argue that they were not a part of any of those different, either vigilante groups or even really involved at the level of sheriffs. They didn't really have police outside of the large cities in the Deep South, but, sheriffs, marshals, any of the law enforcement control, they were actually the people, along with the enslaved, who were being surveilled, who were being controlled and imprisoned. And in the Deep South, the vast majority of people who are being locked up in jails and prisons aren't the enslaved, because, of course, planters wanted to control any kind of punishment for slaves themselves. They wanted to quickly whip a slave and get them right back out to work. They weren't going to sit them in jail, for days and weeks at a time, losing their labor. They were going to quickly discipline, quickly physically humiliate and abuse someone and get them right back out into the plantation. But for poor whites, they were constantly trading with slaves in this kind of underground economy where slaves would appropriate mainly foodstuffs from the plantations and trade them with poor whites, mainly for liquor. And so they're constantly being arrested for these kind of petty, for all intents and purposes, crimes with slaves, or for things like vagrancy, which is literally being arrested for not doing anything, for, not working, for standing on a street corner. Any kind of behavioral crimes, gambling, drinking, lewd behavior for women. So they were constantly locking up these poor whites, just not only as a form of labor control, I argue, but also as a form of social control, and to keep them from interacting with slaves on any kind of personal or business level.
And where were the majority of the poor whites, if a generalization can be made, where were they mostly concentrated? More in the mountainous areas where agriculture is poor, or were they more concentrated in the cities, or was it kind of a mix?
Well, so in each little town, each county area, most of the richer people would be near the center of town. And as you kind of get out to the outskirts, the edges of town, a lot of poor whites would be congregating kind of at the edges. You know, a lot of them are squatters. They don't own land. If they are actually on a piece of land, they're usually tenant farmers or sharecroppers. But there are definitely a lot, you know, in Appalachia and the mountain areas. And there are a lot in the cities. And I actually argue that even though many historians downplay immigration to the South in the 1840s and 50s, it's actually a huge deal, because in these southern port cities like Charleston, Savannah, New Orleans, Mobile, all of these port cities are having huge influxes, not only of German immigrants, but of Irish immigrants who come over, especially the famine Irish, and they don't want to compete with enslaved labor. They don't want to compete with free black labor, because free blacks' wages undercut any kind of white wages. And so, you know, these were angry men who wanted to unionize, who wanted to strike. And there becomes a lot of labor unrest in these cities, especially for dock workers and, you know, jobs like that in the 1850s. And as we're approaching secession, and I make the case that it's not surprising that the push for secession starts in Charleston, where you have all of these kind of militant white laborers. As South Carolina is seeing their slaves being drained to the western states of Mississippi and Texas and Arkansas to go work the cotton lands out there, you know, they're losing black laborers that they can completely control and brutalize and beat. But at the same time, they're gaining these kind of militant white workers from Europe into the cities. And you see all of these Southern fire eaters, you know, their ideas are coming straight from Charleston, because they're seeing this change from black laborers that they can completely control to these white laborers that they really can't control.
Interesting. Now, was there any kind of program or project to try and encourage white immigration? Because from the sounds of it, as opposed to, for example, in Cuba, where there was a conscious program to try and encourage white immigration to whiten the country, it sounds like in this case, white immigration was actually a bad thing from the standpoint of the planters.
Right. They did not want it. There was no effort to encourage it by any means. They actively sought out immigrants, you know, for extra surveillance. As we're entering, you know, the last couple of years before secession, there are all these vigilante committees, either called Minutemen groups or vigilance groups, that spring up. And not only are they, again, policing black people, but also poor whites and especially immigrants. And, you know, tarring and featherings were constant, just terrorizing people and sending them out of their localities, out of their states. They did not want them there. They saw them as nuisances. They saw them as people who would, you know, just feed alcohol and bad ideas to the enslaved, people who would reproduce with the enslaved, which I argue, you know, babies at the time took on the status of their mothers. So planters were always very fearful that poor white women would be sleeping with black men, and especially poor white women would be prostituting themselves to black men. And so poor white women actually had the ability to create this entire class of free blacks, essentially, right? Mixed race children who were legally entitled to freedom.
And I remember that there's a project in I think it was the 1820s. Henry Clay was pushing a project to get to eliminate the problem of free blacks in the South by trying to get them all to move to Liberia. That kind of petered out, right? Or
mm-hmm. Yes, absolutely. Any kind of emancipation, you know, sending your slaves back to Liberia or anything, that was mostly in the Upper South. These Lower South states were the ones buying a lot of the emancipated, or, you know, if they would be recaptured or something in the Upper South, they'd be sold back down south. Or if a slave owner in the Upper South wanted to sell his slaves, he'd sell them down south, down to South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, and then eventually they start, you know, making their way to the West. But during the 1830s and 40s, about 800,000 slaves are sold from the Upper South to the Lower South. And I argue that this influx of laborers really does displace poor whites who had always historically worked in agriculture. A lot of them as just day laborers or people hired, just on, wage contracts. And, they had always been working in agriculture. All these slaves, this influx of slaves comes in and they're displaced from their jobs. They're not desired as laborers because you can brutalize enslaved laborers and make them work for a hell of a lot cheaper than you can have, a white person working for you. So they literally are underemployed, unemployed, and that tends to make them pretty transient. They start, the men travel around a lot in search of work, whether they can work on highways, whether they can work on, the new railroads, any kind of industry. There's a little bit of industrialization as in factories going up in the 1840s and 50s. Poor whites make some inroads there. But it still just depends on whether or not it's economically more viable for planters to work their slaves in the factories or in the fields, and they do whatever makes the most economic sense.
Now, I recently read, or relatively recently read, Edward Baptist's The Half Has Never Been Told. I'm sure I'm screwing up. I always screw up the title.
No, that's perfect.
Yeah. In his book, one of the arguments is that the advance of the increase of demand for textiles and the advances in processing cotton, such as the cotton gin, created this advance in the brutality of and the efficiency of the Southern slave regime, where slaves were picking on an individual basis, were picking systematically more and more and more cotton. And from the 1830s, you also see a decline in the price of cotton as crises of overproduction happen. Did that affect like the ability of poor whites to participate even in a limited sense in the agriculture?
Well, so, and I have to preface this by saying that I think Baptist's book is great in the fact that it does highlight the sheer brutality, and it was a brutal, brutal system, and that needs to be brought to the forefront. However, his ratcheting thesis is still not completely accepted by a lot of people in the field, especially by economists and people that focus on kind of agricultural labor. They think that there are different, from varieties of new seed types to, better soil, to different methods that, whether it's working longer hours in a day. There are different ways that, production is going to rise. So I don't want to blame that all necessarily on the brutality, because I think while it is a very brutal system, the brutality varied a lot from time and place, and just by master or overseer. I want to stress that in the South, everything is intensely, intensely local. And even more than that, it's almost like these little fiefdoms, these little tiny little kingdoms of a planter and all of his slaves, and then all the people who are dependent upon his own plantation. But so cotton actually hits a slump in the 1840s, off of the Panic of 1837. And so that's when you see a lot of planters moving their slaves into non-agricultural work. So whether it's in the factories, whether it's learning an actual skilled artisanal trade, whether it's working on roads and railroads, different types of burgeoning industries. And so when cotton prices start skyrocketing in the 1850s, they do pull most of their slaves back onto the plantation, which ostensibly would have left a lot of jobs open for poor whites. But it doesn't really seem to alleviate a lot of the poverty and suffering. And maybe that's because there are more people pulled into this kind of cyclical poverty by this time. But there are still, it's a major, major problem of what to do with these, underemployed, unemployed white laborers. And planters actually, as they're contemplating the fact that we might be pulled into a civil war, they really start questioning, what are we going to do with white laborers? And there's one school of thought that says, well, let's basically make kind of a sliding scale of slavery and actually, make them into bound laborers as well. It might not be the exact same thing as black slavery, but it's going to be some sort of unfree bound labor. And then another school of thought was, well, let's confine all black people to the soil. Let's make anyone with any kind of pigment in their skin only agricultural workers, and then put all poor whites into the factories and into the non-agricultural low-level labor jobs. And it becomes a really big debate between these slaveholders in the Deep South. And I really think, had the Civil War not ended slavery, you might possibly have seen some sort of backsliding on any kind of freedoms that poor whites did have.
Interesting. And those arguing for making enslaved black labor purely agricultural, and trying to push all these poor whites into more industrial and artisanal jobs, was that done because of were they pushing that purely out of a sense of self-interest, or was it also that an attempt to create this sense of belonging within the system?
I think it's both things. Definitely, it's definitely self-interest. They want to impose segregation, and there weren't a lot of laws about segregation in the Deep South prior to the Civil War. It was, there were laws against, you can't drink together, you can't sell liquor to a slave. That was about as close as you get to segregation. Otherwise, it's just planters and slaveholders trying to impose segregation themselves. And they did use legal apparatus to do that, but there weren't necessarily laws on the books about it. But also, on the other side, as you were saying, they did think that if they elevated white laborers to non-agricultural jobs, because agriculture was becoming so associated with the enslaved, they thought that, that was a psychological wage of whiteness, to at least not be working the land anymore.
And out of curiosity, since we're getting onto the topic of whiteness, and you mentioned that many were actually Irish immigrants, were the Irish immigrants in particular, but other immigrants from other quote unquote more swarthy parts of Europe, were they considered white by the white planter elites?
So they are from a legal classification, and every state pretty much had different legal classifications of how you determine someone's race. Some states had essentially what percentage are you? Some states had do you actually look black? Do you actually look white? So it gets really complicated. And there aren't a ton of what we would call the swarthier looking immigrants in the Deep South at this time. Not a lot of Eastern Europeans or Southern Europeans, but there are several court cases where they're distinctly saying this man's not Portuguese, he's actually black. But the interesting thing is, if you actually look at the literature from that time, poor whites are always talked about as being swarthy. They're always talked about as being like brown-skinned, yellow-skinned. They're always conceived of in a way that's not quite white. And I guess, that's something that I think more attention probably needs to be paid to in the next generation of scholarship. It's a really interesting line of study.
Interesting. And since we've talked a little bit about race and class, from the outside, it seems that there seems to be a kind of debate between scholars looking at antebellum, the Antebellum South, with people trying to center different scholars or schools of scholarship trying to center different problems. You have those who try and center as the essential problem more racial dynamics, others who maybe try and emphasize class a bit more, others who try and establish a balance. Would you say that that's an accurate characterization of kind of the discussion in the field?
Yeah, I think that's right. Class, I think in the last 20, 30 years has gotten short shrift from scholars. Labor history went kind of out of favor in the 80s, 90s. There are very few labor historians left in America, unfortunately. And class as a unit of analysis has not really been emphasized except for in pretty rare cases. And I was just thinking about this the other day, actually. Thinking back to graduate school, and I graduated in 2014. It wasn't all that long ago. But studying other geographical areas, whether it's, early modern Europe or South America or ethnohistory, any of those other kinds of areas that you study in history, there's a lot about class. But when you're taking basic American history studies, even in graduate school, you're not talking about class very much because a lot of historians don't use it as a means of analysis anymore. Marxism is out of vogue, and maybe now it's starting to see a little bit of a comeback. And actually, some of the youngest scholars in the field are from the South and probably are the most progressive and most leftist out of any of the scholars around today. And I think that the field is ripe to start talking about class again. I mean, race has got some amazing scholars on it, and they've been at it for the last 20, 30 years. They've taken up, the short shrift that field has gotten for so long, and they've made up time for it and really caught up. We've got some amazing scholars of race today, and I hope that class gets to that level someday.
Of the scholars who've been talking about race in the past 20, 30 years, what do you think is kind of more a prominent figure, one of the more prominent achievements that they've made?
Well, I love Barbara Fields and her sister Karen Fields and what they've done about really reconceptualizing the fact that race is not, it's all a social construct, but in realizing the realities of what that social construct can mean and the realities of what you look like, means in reality. But today, the African American Intellectual History Society is a great place to go to their online blog, Black Perspectives. The work of Keisha Blaine, Ibram Kendi is now running, one of the biggest programs at American University, anti-racist program there. So we've got a lot of great scholarship that'll be coming out in the next few years.
Didn't he also just get I think he has a column now at The Atlantic.
Yes, just named the latest Atlantic columnist.
Yeah. So going back to the topic, for poor whites in the South, what did I'm trying to figure out to the extent to which the limited institutions that existed in the South had them kind of at the margins. So, for example, education. What kind of access to education did they have?
They basically didn't have any. In contrast, again, to some of the upper South states, the Deep South had no universal system of education. And even the places or the localities that might have had a little bit of, what we would consider an attempt at providing schools to the masses didn't even come close to helping, your average person read and write. And I argue that the census records of, showing whether or not people are literate are just completely unreliable. They're completely false because you're talking about an honor-based society. And if you look at how the census records were taken themselves, they're horribly flawed, horribly tabulated. Everything about them is wrong. But when you're actually going to a grown man's house and asking him in front of his family, a complete stranger from the government, asking him if he can read and write, there are very few men in an honor-based society that are going to just admit that fact to a stranger. But I also argue that as these Southern leaders are realizing that they may be dragged into a war, or at least they may need to secede from the Union to keep slavery going, that they start thinking about, well, we may need to educate these poor whites at least just enough so that they can perform as soldiers, so that they can be good soldiers for us. And they come up with this plan to take, a promising boy, usually from like a middle class background, and educate them only at Southern schools. And they all say this to educate them on Southern institutions. They're basically wanting to indoctrinate them about the positive goods of slavery, the so-called positive goods of slavery, and then have those men teach and indoctrinate everyone else in their little locality about slavery. And in order to just give the poorest people a basic level of reading and writing so that they can perform as foot soldiers in, the Confederate Army.
And I know it's you focus on the South, but what kind of educational rights or what kind of access to education was there in the North? 'Cause I'm just trying to figure out, there was obviously not the level of educational and government infrastructure that there is today. But I'm trying to think of, even within the context of the 19th century, if this was just particularly, if education and all the rest was particularly absent.
Oh, yeah. It's a complete difference between the North and the South. The North is actually, small-scale capitalism. It's relatively egalitarian. You have a lot of small landholders, small business owners. There is actually, a chance, not for everybody, but for a lot of people, there's a chance at upward mobility in their lifetimes. And I argue that in the South, that just isn't there. There's not a chance to escape from cyclical poverty because the system is so structured to perpetuate this extreme wealth inequality. And so if you're born into a poor family in the South, you're never going to become educated. You're never going to get out of this cyclical poverty. And that's exactly why, somebody like Lincoln, you think about Lincoln's father, wanted to get the hell out of Kentucky and get to a free state, not because he cared a minute about what's happening to the slaves. He doesn't care what's happening to the slaves. He wants to be able to work on his own without having to compete with brutalized slave labor. He wants to be able to work on his own in a society where he can maybe buy a little piece of land, and not every single parcel of land is bought up by the biggest slaveholder who owns, half the county. So there is a really big difference between the two sections of the country, and that's why I argue that the Republican Party is really, really threatening to Southern planters, because they realize that if poor white Southerners heard about what the Republican Party was offering, not only in terms of what they think laborers should get, whether it's workers' rights, shorter hours, better working conditions, but also the Republican Party was pushing the Homestead Acts. They were pushing land reform. They were trying to give land to people who didn't have any to start out with. And that would have been truly revolutionary had poor whites actually known what the Republican Party was offering.
And in terms of land, during this whole period, and I think even during the Civil War, there was a push westward, and there was the continued annexation of indigenous lands, and in the South, many of them being, sold to first of all by the planters, bought by the planters. But why was there not was there an effort to try and settle some of these poor whites onto those lands as well?
So there is. It depends again on time and place. Not really is the answer, but probably the best case scenario for poor white to have gotten land in the Deep South would have been with the Cherokee land lottery in Georgia, which occurs, in the 1830s. But even people who, there are two economic historians who have looked at this, and they concluded that, if you were already wealthy or already middle class and won that land lottery, that your wealth keeps continuing to improve, keeps continuing to increase over the next few decades. But if you were a poor person and won that land lottery, you actually end up in a place not that much better than what you started out from a few decades before. So we see time and again how much it's not just wealth or just policy that changes something fundamentally for people. It's it's a long history of whether or not your family has wealth and whether or not they know what to do with it and how to propagate it.
And for even those who got a small bit of land, what about the issue of infrastructure? Because my understanding is that from the 1830s on, you start to get railroads and the like. But I imagine that it's not just a matter of land having land somewhere, but if you're going to produce cotton, you have to have a way to get it to market, right?
You're absolutely correct. And that's why, I said earlier on at the beginning of the podcast that if you had a small farm, even if you're producing a very minimal amount of cotton, you need to be able to get it on a railroad and get it, to market, like you said. So the people that own even, the smallest farms have interests that align more with the slaveholders than they do with people that are completely cut off of and, left out of the system.
And out of curiosity, who owned the railroads at this point? Like, was it the state, or it was small companies or private?
So the states funded them. They were built by private companies that were state funded. By usually a lot of, I should say, it differs by state, but it seems like a lot of the money actually comes from poll taxes, and then some special, tariff levies that states would put out.
Because I ask because I'm thinking about when the oil boom happens in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, one of the issues that some of the oilmen complained about was that there was kind of a monopoly at that point of many of the railroads, and there could be special prices set for larger oilmen and things like that.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it's this system has always been structured to favor, a few extremely wealthy families who all tend to intermarry and, again, propagate that, huge wealth disparity.
And when the Civil War finally does break out, like you mentioned that they had kind of tried to implement some policies to try and make these poor whites associate themselves more with, planter interests. How did that end up playing out during the Civil War itself?
Well, so I argue that most poor whites are not supportive of the Confederacy. And even if you look at voting, there are not a lot of people voting, period. But, I argue that they don't have a lot of free will in voting to begin with. But if you just look at the 1860 election, and then you look at the secession election, there's a huge drop-off in numbers. So there's not very many people voting in the secession election. And we still don't have definitive evidence as to whether that was because, votes were actively suppressed or, people just didn't know enough or they didn't care. But secession just passes by a hair. And in a lot of states like Georgia, it passes only by fraud, by force and fraud. But most poor whites don't want to fight, and they don't sign up to go fight in the beginning. And this is now being proven that most of the people that are fighting in the beginning of the Civil War are either from the families of slaveholders or they're connected to these families of slaveholders in some important economic way. And there are some poor whites that are forced to fight. Like I said, all these vigilance committees and Minutemen committees, they're literally leading these people off in chains and forcing them to fight. They're saying, we're going to charge you with vagrancy unless you sign up. But in 1862, the Confederate Army passes the Conscription Act. And so that's when I think you see a lot of poor whites are being let off and forced to fight. And that's also why I make the case that by 1863 and 64, at least half, if not closer to 2/3 of the Confederate Army has deserted. It's because they just don't want to fight. They have no desire to fight to preserve the wealth of slaveholders. And they honestly didn't even really support slavery. They didn't like blacks. They didn't like they were horrible racists, but they didn't support slavery because they understood what slavery did to their own livelihoods.
Interesting. And in the aftermath of the Civil War, there was I've read that there's kind of a battle for the memory of how the memory of the Civil War was handled. How did the perception of I mean, I know this is kind of going outside of your field, and public history is kind of a field in and of itself. But that said, how did the perception of, the role of poor whites kind of get treated, whether in academia or in popular culture after the Civil War?
No, I mean, that's a great question, and one I will probably write a book on to carry this study through the Reconstruction period, because I think W.E.B. Du Bois was right that there's a complete realignment of race and class in the Deep South in the first few years of Reconstruction, where there was, right after the war, a very real possibility that poor whites and blacks would band together, and many of them did actually band together politically to try to fight for rights for poor people. But they were crushed not only by politically by the old planter families that are still in power, but also by just sheer vigilante violence of the Klan. And as we get into the late Reconstruction period, and of course into Jim Crow, the entire narrative changes into this, this kind of white solidarity, and it's always been white solidarity. But within that, it completely erases what actually happened prior to, probably 1868, 69.
And the treatment in popular culture certainly hasn't been that great. During our conversations, I keep thinking back to Gone with the Wind, which was not very kind.
Right. But of course, that's made in 38, 39. By the 1940s, you've got a couple of historians just who are rabid racist, pro-South, pro-Confederates, who are completely changing the narrative even of history and claiming that poor whites basically didn't exist. And I'm thinking particularly of Frank Owsley, one of the Nashville agrarians. But it basically argues poor whites didn't exist, that if anybody was landless, any white person was landless in the Antebellum South, it was because they wanted to be, that they were just, from good old Celtic stock, and they wanted to herd cattle and not have anything to worry about and just drink and fiddle and play and have fun. And, it was this mindset of what they wanted instead of them actively being completely cut off from economic society, certainly, but also social society, by the fact that they were cyclically impoverished because of slavery.
What would you say are, in the coming I mean, you've kind of touched on this already, but in the coming decades, what would you say are kind of some of the major challenges still facing the field?
The field itself, I think, we've got so many disparate stories about the Antebellum South from different kind of disciplines. You've got this kind of new history of capitalism looking at one aspect of it, but then you've got this really rich literature from economic historians, and we haven't integrated any of those kind of schools of thought together. We have all this great work done on slavery, and yet we really need more labor history, I think, to round out and kind of connect all of these different fields together. Even the basic arguments over, as you were talking about, Ed Baptist's ratcheting theory could be answered by labor history. Have we had enough of it? We still don't know some of the basics of how slaves labored, how, what they exactly labored at, and how poor whites then fit into that as well. We know that they worked side by side sometimes, but we don't know much about how all of those things happened on the ground.
And you also already kind of touched on this other thing too, but what are some of the great achievements in your field that you really are proud of in the last decade or so?
Well, again, I think bringing the sheer brutality of slavery, because I think even when I was in college, it was still the narrative of, well, slavery was bad and horrible, but, it does get a little bit more humane as time goes on. Back in the era of the Republic, the early Republic, they are cutting off ears and hands and fingers and just completely brutalizing people. And by the time you're in the late antebellum, it's, this almost Eugene Genovese, rosy paternalism. Slaves are not happy necessarily, but they're okay with their situation. And I think that the one thing that the historians of capitalism have done an excellent job of is to show us that brutality was still there. And it was economically mediated, I guess. They're not going to cut off an arm of a really good laborer, but they're going to whip the hell out of that person into an inch of their life, and really just brutalize them over and over again. And so I think that's a huge move forward in the profession. But I'm hoping, honestly, that it also becomes more diversified, because it's still very much a domain of white men. In the 19th century, especially the Antebellum South, it's mostly white men working on it. And I'm hoping that the field diversifies some, because I think that will add some really good perspectives into how we approach these problems.
Definitely, and a part of that's definitely going to need to be that schools need to stop cutting funding.
Hey, I agree with you there.
But yeah, great. Well, Keri Leigh Merritt, thank you very much for coming on and talking with us today.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
You've been listening to the Ask Historians podcast. Please support us at patreon.com/AskHistorians. Find more history like this by following us on Twitter and Facebook, and by visiting us at askhistorians.reddit.com and ask hundreds of historians and enthusiasts anything you want to know about history.